Well, earlier we spoke to Talib Ibrahim. He says Turkey should focus on dialogue with the Syrian government to resolve the situation on the border.
The Syrian government is not so happy in what Syrian Democratic Forces are doing, and indeed they are enemies to the Syrian government, and we know that they are separatists and they want to make their own entity and to divide Syria. But the treatment of this situation, I mean Syrian Democratic Forces and other Kurdish troops which are in the eastern of Euphrates, not by occupying Syrian lands. It is by working with Syrian government to put an end to that. And I think Turkey can work via political means and by cooperation with Russia, with Syria, with Iran, and with others to end the situation. And this is, of course, a situation, a terrible situation in the eastern of Euphrates. And nobody in Damascus agrees Syrian Democratic Forces, but everybody is angry here from the Turkish occupation and the Turkish aggression against Syrian territories, whether it was territorial aggression or whether it was by airstrikes.
Well, let's now bring in Marwan Kabalan. He's the Director of Policy Analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He's joining us right here in Doha. Thanks very much for speaking to us on the Al Jazeera News Hour. Let's just start out with what the Vice President of Turkey had to say just about 30 minutes ago. And one of the things he was outlining while speaking in Bursa is that he said this is a first step of other steps. We know that this operation started in Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain. So does it sound to you like this is going to continue? And how deep will Turkey go into Syrian territory?
Yeah, it might be a lengthy process in which Turkey will be actually moving slowly and taking down one by one of the Kurdish forces in the north of Syria. Actually, the positions of the Kurdish forces in the northeast of Syria. We all know actually that Turkey has from the very beginning requested that they go like into 30 to 40 kilometers deep into Syrian territories. But the Americans have always actually opposed this, this proposal by Turkey. And they were saying that they were willing actually to accept something like between 5 and 7 kilometers deep into Syrian territory, and only on the strip of land that actually goes between Tal Abyad and Jarablus, meaning 140 kilometers long along the borders between Syria and Turkey. Turkey, on the other hand, is thinking that this operation should go actually along the borders and the east of the Euphrates, from Jarablus on the Euphrates River to Qamishli in the far northeast. So we still need to know actually what sort of agreements the Turks and the Americans have reached concerning this, this operation.
And when it comes to the international reaction, we're now hearing that the NATO chief has urged restraint from Turkey in the Syria operation. And we've also heard that countries from the EU have called for a Security Council meeting tomorrow. But when you look at who hasn't said anything, that's Russia, clearly an ally of Syria and the Syrian president. How do you explain Russia's silence?
Well, actually, Russia... I mean, in normal situation, Russia would oppose, the Turkish military operation in the northeast of Syria. But what the Russians are doing right now, actually, they are trying to be more flexible with the Russian operation. Why? Because I think the Russians want, on the one hand, to punish the Kurds for allying themselves with the United States. On the other hand, to push them back to embrace the Syrian regime. So I think the Russians are not very unhappy with the Turkish operation, in my opinion.
But the Russians, I beg your pardon, but the Russians, as well as the Iranians and Turkey, in the past have all agreed to the importance of unity when it comes to Syrian territory.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Turkey is also saying that this operation, in order to prevent the breakup of Syria, because Turkey believes that the Kurdish, the YPG, they call it actually the Syrian PKK, is having having an ambition to have a separate state in the northeast of Syria, and that is what Turkey is trying to prevent right now by this military operation. Of course, I mean, Turkey, Iran, and Russia have their disagreement on so many issues, because the ideal situation for Russia and Iran is for the United States to withdraw from the northeast of Syria, and the Syrian regime recover their territories instead. But right now, it's not gonna work like that. It's the Americans that they are there. The Americans, they are allowing the Turks to go inside Syria. The Russians, they can't do much about it, but they are trying to take advantage actually in order to change the dynamic of the alliance in the region by getting the Kurdish forces back to the Syrian regime and back actually under the Russian umbrella, and break up this alliance between the Kurds and the Americans. That is what the Russians are trying to do right now. And also, the Russians are trying to keep Turkey close to them, because Turkey is very important for the Russian actually scheme concerning the political solution in Syria. Don't forget that after all, Russia, Iran, and Turkey are partners in the Astana process, and the Astana process has succeeded in recent weeks in establishing the Constitutional Committee, which is supposed actually to start convening late this month in order to start talking about the drafting of the Syrian resolution as a first step towards political solution in Syria. So the Russians are trying to keep Turkey close to them. The Americans also are trying to keep Turkey close to them. And the one who's...
So what could have been sort of the parameters of this agreement that you mentioned between Turkey and the Americans when it comes to this operation?
Well, I think that the Americans, they allow the Turks actually to go inside Syria, because, as I said earlier, the Turkey has been trying actually to put huge pressure on the Americans in order to accept the sort of Turkish intervention in the north of Syria in order to eliminate the Kurdish forces. But of course, I mean, Turkey is presenting it as an operation to eliminate also ISIL. Turkey now has decided that they will take the leadership of this operation against ISIL, and that was the approach actually they use in order to convince President Trump that you don't have actually to deal with the ISIL anymore. You don't have to deal with the Kurdish forces in Syria anymore. You don't have to keep your forces in Syria anymore. We will take over the responsibility. We will fight ISIL, but on the same time, we will actually fight the YPG and their separatist ambition in the northeast of Syria. That is right now how we see things in between the United States and Turkey.
And the SDF has also appealed to the United States, speaking of the Americans, for a no-fly zone. It's saying to protect it from Turkish attacks in the northeast of Syria. What's the likelihood of that actually happening?
That's not going to happen, in my opinion, because Turkey is a NATO ally. So we don't expect the Americans actually to establish a no-fly zone in order to protect them from a NATO partner. President Trump yesterday, he said Turkey is a very important trade partner for the United States and a very important NATO partner also for the West. So my hunch is that the U.S. president decided actually to sell out the Kurds in this equation, because when he had to choose between Turkey and the Kurds, he decided clearly to go with Turkey, and that is real politics at the end of the day, and that is President Trump, of course, who knows the rules of the game and how things. This is how he used politics, very much like he's using the market as a businessman.
And on the issue of ISIL fighters that you were mentioning a moment ago, a real concern by people over in the Pentagon and also around Trump, who say this could we could see a resurgence of ISIL in the area. But are we any clearer on what Turkey actually plans to do with the ISIL members and how it will deal with that?
Well, I think that was the agreement, as we understand, between President Trump and President Erdogan. They made that agreement over a phone call. We know now that both actually the Secretary of Defense of the United States and the Chief of Staff, they both actually were present during that phone call, which means actually that the President has their support to his agreement with President Erdogan. President Erdogan seemed to have pledged that he will be actually fighting ISIL instead of the United States, and I think that was Turkey's mistake from the very beginning. Had Turkey agreed actually to fight ISIL since 2014, 2015, when President Obama at that time actually offered to have to choose Turkey and the Syrian opposition factions at that time. But Turkey decided not to do that because Turkey was more preoccupied at that time with the Kurdish question, with the challenge of the Kurdish factions in the northeast of Syria. Now Turkey decided that we will go against ISIL, we will take this responsibility, so the Americans don't need actually to stay in Syria and pay the cost of staying in the northeast of Syria. But that's going to be on the expense of the Kurds, in my opinion.
All right, Marwan Kabalan, we'll leave it there for now. We thank you very much for speaking to us.